Poe works at the intersection of geopolitics and technology with with work spanning 15 plus countries. She has advised governments, major tech companies, and the UN on foreign policy, AI governance, and the messier paths of platform regulation. And also, she loves cats and a big fan of pop culture. So let's welcome Poe. Yeah.
Hello, can everybody hear me at the back? Yay, wonderful. I do love cats. I have on cat socks that I got in Paris right now. It's a big cat fan. Thank you for having me. My name is Poe, and today I'm gonna walk you through a somewhat interactive presentation. I say somewhat because there's going to be a lot of talking but a little bit of participation. And so I want to prime you for that. So on that, if you're down to participate, hands up. And by that, I mean everybody's hand should be immediately up. Yeah. That's what we mean. Yes. Wonderful. All right. So today we're going to talk a little bit about AI governance and how different governments around the world govern AI. And so I won't be getting into the weeds too much because it's only about 15 minutes. But this is, again, somewhat interactive. So, here we go. All right. So let's set the scene. Imagine you just got hired as a head of AI regulation for a mid-sized country. Let's call this country Canada, right? And your prime minister is Barney. And this matters. Because you're new, you're ambitious, and you are ready for your big deliverable. And that is nothing too ambitious, just to develop an MVP governance framework in 6 months, right? Crazy, crazy. But to take the pressure off just a little bit, it doesn't have to be operational in 6 months, but you do have to know what the contours of it looks like. What is the shape of it, right? So just no big details, just the big outlines. All right. And so where do you start? You start by doing stakeholder consultations. And as you're doing stakeholder consultations, you're quickly realizing that there's a bunch of tensions that are starting to build up. You're hearing them over and over again. And the first big tension is innovation versus clarity. So some believe that strong regulations will kill experimentation, especially in fields like AI. But others say that clear rules are exactly what will allow you to define the white space for innovation. If you don't have it, how do you know where to innovate? The second big tension that you're starting to see is human rights versus speed. And so here we're talking about some stakeholders wanting, robust human rights impact assessments that can be audited and challenged. But others argue that having such a robust assessment means that the technology will have moved on by the time you finish governing, and then the window to govern will have closed, so your citizens will already be using ungoverned AI. The third big tension is transparency versus security. Somewhat full algorithmic transparency, so systems can be audited and sort of challenged. Others argue that transparency creates security vulnerabilities and it exposes proprietary information. So we've got IP concerns here. All right. And the last but not least is really relevant because remember, you are Canada, you're a mid-sized power, okay? And so if you regulate too hard, companies will leave and they'll deploy elsewhere and your citizens will again use ungoverned AI anyway. On the other hand, if you don't regulate hard enough, what you're doing is exporting your ungoverned AI to another country. And so there we go, ungoverned AI either way. So the problem is not necessarily that that anybody is on either one or the other side of the spectrum, because it's a spectrum. You're not choosing between X and Y. What you're doing is you're balancing values. And so that's the thing with tensions. They aren't resolved, they're weighted. They're weighted based on the priorities of the government at any point in time. All right, so let's step out of Canada for a moment, because these are very real tensions that governments all over the world are trying to solve for at this very moment. But before we dig into the differences and how they surface depending on these priorities, let's talk about what all governance designs and models have in common. every single jurisdiction, every single government has 5 key operational dimensions. The first is authority. Who makes the decisions? Who is in charge? Who does approvals? Who halts a system? Who retires a system? And most importantly, where in the government does this authority sit? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? The second big one is enforcement. And here we're talking about governing instruments. So that's a policy term. Essentially, it's about laws. Is it binding? Is it not binding? Is it voluntary frameworks? What does your enforcement actually look like on the ground? The third thing that we're looking at is risk operationalization. How is risk translated into action? So here we're talking about how do you define risk tiers? Do you even define risk tiers? Do you slice it in terms of, let's prohibit certain use cases? Or do we look at it in terms of capability? The fourth thing that we're looking at is failure and escalation. So what happens when a system underperforms or worse, causes harm? And if you've ever worked in cybersecurity or data governance, then you know what escalation paths and ownership structures look like. So essentially something goes wrong, who do you talk to? Who's the next person that you speak to? Last but not least is compliance and accountability. And here we're talking about how is adherence monitored? Do you have oversight bodies? And that's really quite important. And so what's important here is that those tensions that we talked about, that surfaced earlier, they show up in these operational dimensions, and they sort of define the governance structure and the governance design of each government. And jurisdictions approach these dimensions quite differently depending on their priorities. And of the 5 different layers that I talked about, authority and enforcement are the primary drivers of governance design. They have the most variance and explanatory power for why a government chooses to make a specific choice. The other 3 dimensions, compliance and accountability, failure and escalation, and to a much lesser extent, risk operationalization, they tend to follow downstream depending on what form of authority and what form of enforcement a government chooses. So, and this is where it gets really interesting, because if you use authority and enforcement as sort of these axes to start to compare and contrast between these different governments and how they govern, you start to get a very, very sort of interesting map. And so what I mean is if we put authority on the x-axis and we have decentralized on one hand and centralized on the other, and then we put enforcement on the y-axis with binding up at the top and soft guidance at the bottom, you get this map. Now, this is where the participation comes in, all right? If you, without me telling you anything else, right, like just knowing that one quadrant is binding law and central authority, and one is soft guidance and decentralized, where in the 4 quadrants would you put Banada in? So I'm going to go one by one. So who's in the top left? That is binding law and centralized authority. Is that correct? Top right, yes, top right. Nobody? One person? 1, 2, 3, 4. Just 4 people. Five. Okay, can you write that down? We're going to do a recount later. Okay. Who is in the top left? So that's binding law and decentralized authority. Oh, we've got, all right, hands up. I can't count. Yeah, okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. I think did I count you? Okay, all right, sorry. Yeah. Who's down here? Bottom right. Yeah, this is centralized authority, but soft guidance, nothing binding. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Did you vote or did you change your mind? Okay, all right. Yeah, okay. And then I'm gonna assume everybody else is in the rest, or because otherwise it would mean that you didn't vote and you weren't participating. So who's in the bottom left? Decentralized authority, okay, and soft guidance. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, all right, incredible. All right, so let's see where the different countries end up being. And what I did was I looked at a few equal in power jurisdictions and some leading jurisdictions. I also looked at cities, but they're not on it. Okay, so What we've got is EU and China in the top right. So that's the regulatory stronghold. So now we're talking about archetypes. We've got the UK and Australia in the compliance led over there. So, they've got guidance, but again, it's not binding. And then in the bottom left, we've got the US, Singapore, and Hong Kong. The US has moved. It used to be a lot more strict, but under this administration, they have rolled back a few regulations that the Biden administration had. All right, so does that make you guys feel comfortable about where you are, what you voted for? Yeah, we're okay with it? Okay, cool. Now let's get into each of the different archetypes. So let's talk about the regulatory stronghold. So jurisdictions under this archetype primarily exercise governance through binding law and centralized regulatory bodies. And public bodies are regulated by an external administrator rather than self-governing actors. The strength of this model is clarity. Okay, it allows for strong accountability with legal obligations and enforcement. On the other hand, this archetype really struggles with regulatory lag, especially in a space like AI where it moves fast, like really quite fast. And typically, and it quite depends on the type of level of democratization in the country, but typically it can mean low levels of experimentation within the public service. And so that kind of makes sense, right? Like the EU and China's there. China does do a lot more with experimentation, but that's because it's a centrally held government. So they can move fast when they do want to. And then let's move on to the compliance-led states. Now we're talking about the UK, we're talking about Australia. And so these administrations or jurisdictions, they embed governance into administrative processes rather than law. So individual ministries and agencies, they retain operational control over the development and deployment of AI systems, but deployment is conditional on completing specific processes, such as mandatory impact assessments before and documentation before full deployment. The strength of this model is that it scales really well. And in relation to regulatory strongholds, they're a lot more adaptable as the technology moves. However, it can lead to a very strong audit culture. If you're sort of like checking off all the things that you have to do, then what you end up doing is you replace professional judgment with an over-reliance on process. And so that takes us to our very last archetype, which is the guided autonomy states. So the US, Singapore, Hong Kong. And even in this, there's a lot of variance in execution, you'll sort of see. So this model requires a high level of digital maturity and capacity building. Since governance is modeled through voluntary frameworks, assurance toolkits, and best practice guidance, what you're seeing is any form of successful implementation means that the organizations need strong AI capacity inside of it, and there needs to be highly AI literate policy advisors and frontline staff. The strength of this model is that it encourages internal experimentation, which, in my opinion, a lot of governments could use more of. However, this model can be fragile under public scrutiny because if something does go wrong, then there's not that much recourse built into it. There might also be inconsistent applications of governance with each company or team sort of approaching governance differently because there is no sort of like strong set standard of what governance should look like. All right, now let's take a deeper look at what different case studies look like. Oh, yes, actually, a caveat. No jurisdiction sits perfectly in one box. Governance drifts. In fact, I would say the UK used to be a lot closer to Singapore, but now it's moving upwards because they're now becoming more interested in having legally binding law. They're talking a lot about it. In fact, they wanted to get a law on the books earlier this year, but they have since delayed it. Sounds like what? Canada, not Canada. And so, what I want to impress on you here is that this is ultimately a snapshot. Any sort of choices that a government makes on AI governance represents a few things. One, it's the politics of the moment, the priorities of the moment, and what they're able to accomplish at this time. It's not permanent positions, and it doesn't sit neatly in one box. So, they're kind of in a box, but they're kind of not. All right, so let's talk about case studies. Okay, so let's talk about the European Union and how they actually govern. All right, so the EU is the clearest example of a regulatory stronghold. With the introduction of the 2024 Artificial Intelligence Act, or the AIA, it's the world's first comprehensive legislation governing both the public and the private sector. And so what this means is that the European Union has built these sort of interlocking levels of accountability and rights protection alongside the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Act, and the Digital Services Act, which governs social media, essentially. So the AI Act is the main governing instrument here, and it operationalizes risks through a strict 4-tier risk categorization. So they have prohibited AI, so you can't do this whatsoever. So here we're talking about like real-time biometric surveillance or emotion or affective surveillance in workplaces or schools. We've got high-risk categorizations, we've got limited risk categorizations, and low-risk categorizations. All right. And then for failure and escalation, they've got formal regulatory investigations, reporting timelines, corrective orders, and for compliance and accountability, because again, they're sort of binding law. So you have fines and penalties. You've got transparency requirements that they have to meet, mandatory audits, and procurement standards. Where this is a little bit weak, however, is that because it's so stringent, operations, AI, governance operators on the ground find it very, very hard to actually put this into action. So the way the EU AIA works right now is it's happening in 3 stages. In 2025, they had the first stage. In 2026, they've got a second stage. And in 2027, it's when all the companies in the world are all the companies in the EU are meant to sort of be fully compliant with the AIA. However, the difficulty is because it's so hard to make it compliant that every single time they set a deadline for them to be compliant, they've moved it back. And so negotiation is sort of the name of the game when it comes on to compliance. So it sounds really good, right? In practice, we're like, yes, we've got strong laws, we've got all these fines. But because it's so hard for companies to become compliant, what we're seeing is less compliance. Okay, and then let's talk about the UK. So the UK, it sort of has authority through existing sector regulators. So what that means is if you are in the finance sector and you've got financial AI, then the finance regulators will regulate you. It also has enforcement through existing non-AI regulations and law. So the UK has the Digital Services Act, which sort of governs social media. So if you have, AI under social media, then you would be sort of privy to comply under those laws. So it's not that they don't have any regulations whatsoever. There is still some regulation that is happening. It's not a free-for-all. It just so happens that it's not necessarily an AI law. It's just governed through other structures. But they are trying to be very pro-innovation. In fact, if you watch sort of press releases, or if you read press releases and you watch press conferences with their AI commissioners, they'll sort of say, yeah, we're very pro-innovation. We don't want to we're trying not to adopt an AI law, even though I think behind the scenes they are sort of pushing for that AI law. So how do they operationalize risk? So they've got non-AI impact assessments. So here we're talking about data protection impact assessments that you still have to do. We've got technical capabilities, and actually I think that's really interesting. So the UK is one of those few places where they've started to think about technology and risk in terms of capability. So they sort of distinguish between general purpose models, generative AI, and agents, which I haven't seen any other jurisdiction kind of do. And it's quite different if you compare it to the EU, which is specifically like banning certain categories or sort of doing it by use case. Okay, and then for failure and escalation, it's done through regular sectoral channels. So if something goes wrong, then you would report up through the regular structures that you already have. There's no established AI recourse structure. For compliance and accountability, again, because it's under the sectors, you follow sector compliance regimes. Okay, Now let's talk about Singapore. So I'm really, really fascinated and kind of biased about Singapore. And the reason for that is I think they just sort of encourage a ton of experimentation. So one big example is they have already sort of released government guidance for private sector companies on their use of agentic risk and just agents in general. So it's literally called the Agentic Risk and Capability Framework. So AI agents, as many of you are probably already using with like Claude Cowork and all that, are not something that most governments have addressed because sort of getting guidance out there is a very like long and complicated process. But because Singapore is sort of, they govern as they go, they're very fast moving, they've released a lot of guidance already. So they're not very shy to sort of experiment even inside the public sector. All right, so Singapore's approach to AI governance is highly reliant on organizational self-governance rather than a centralized regulatory body. So just like the UK, they sort of govern through sector regulators, but they explicitly say that they're very, very pro-innovation. So they have these sort of like sandboxes where you're able to experiment. So Singapore does not have any binding law on AI and uses existing legal regimes on data governance and cybersecurity to govern. However, it sort of uses technology to govern AI. So what I mean is they have these things called, so they've got the Model AI Governance Framework, so it's a voluntary framework. But again, and this is because I think Singapore is a high trust society, but because it's so high trust, even though it's a voluntary framework, all the private sector companies really seem to have adopted it. And to help them adopt this, they've also created this thing called AI Verify. And AI Verify is essentially an assurance toolkit. And so you can submit, I guess, parts of your code, and it'll sort of tell you, where you're sort of like missing pieces and where you need to like beef up security. I'm not a technical person. This is all that I've heard. So if you have questions on AI Verify, I can look it up for you, but I will not know. I'm just getting ahead of that. Okay, and so how does it operationalize risk? It does informal risk assessments and technical validation, again, through AI Verify. And failure and escalation is through regular sectoral channels. Compliance and accountability, how does that happen? Documentation through the AI Verify, assurance results through AI Verify, and alignment with national frameworks, which again, as I said, they've all seemed to really taken on. Okay, all of this leads to one question. Where is Canada? Where do you guys think Canada falls on this? Oh, okay, all right, yep. Where do you think it is? Which one? The bank, okay, so we've got soft guidance and centralized authority. Okay, you had your hand up.
Decentralized and soft.
Decentralized and soft. Anybody else? Yes.
Oh, we decentralized and compliance led?
Decentralized and compliance led. Actually, you know what? That's sort of, who thinks it's down here? Who agrees with, what was your name? Okay, all right. So who thinks it's up here? Who thinks it's a regulatory stronghold? Yeah, that's correct. It's not a regulatory stronghold. Who thinks it's compliance led? Okay, all right. And who thinks it's a guided autonomic state? Okay, this is a little bit of a trick question. I'm sorry. It is technically compliance led, so that is where we are. But this is mainly for public sector governance, AI governance, because again, Canada doesn't really have laws. We don't have anything binding. However, we do have the ADM, which governs public sector use of AI. And so, yeah, I think we're moving towards it. We've got the AIDA, which didn't pass, but it's there. And so that's where we are. And yeah, I think that might be it. The main thing that I wanted to sort of impress upon you is there is no sort of like right way to do AI governance. Everything depends on your priorities and what it is that you want to enable at any one moment in time. So what Singapore has enabled is very, very strong pro-innovation. What the UK is also trying to enable is pro-innovation. But because they're also trying to balance it out with human rights, put them into the compliance-led world. And what the EU is trying to do is just make it very, very human rights focused. And that is what leads it there. So yeah, that's it. I do want to take one final vote. So at the beginning, I think we had our original numbers. There were, what were the numbers? Okay, there were 5 people in the regulatory stronghold. Has anybody changed their minds? Yeah, you've kind of changed your mind. Yeah, where would you put it now?
I'm a bit torn because I can see how this could potentially work out for Singapore and Hong Kong, blow up in US's face,
Yeah.
and how we could have challenges.
Oh, okay. So I'm not going to repeat myself. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, people online. Anyway, long story short, I feel like Canada's really great at making sure that everybody checks off all the boxes and fills out all the forms and everything else. But I can see how that's going to stymie us in wanting to be where we would like to be aspirationally speaking, right?
Okay.
I don't
So,
think there's any right answers.
yeah, I
at
don't think
all,
so either. Yeah.
But I feel like we're going to be there and it's not going to be great and we're going to make it work.
Okay. So you're saying you used to be here, but now you might move down here, but that's also risky. No. Where would you be? Compliance led. Okay. All right. Anybody that was in compliance led, sorry,
Is
yes.
the question where we think Canada should be or where we think Canada is now?
Oh, no, the question is when you were Canada, which is different from Canada, right? Like at the beginning, a few of you guys sort of decided before you knew the risks of each model where you were. Have you changed your stance? It's like
Where I am. So I'm a Canadian.
yes.
So I
At the beginning, before we sort of had laid out the archetypes, right? Without any of the countries, where were you originally?
well, the question was, where did I think Canada sat?
Yes. Where
Okay.
would you put
Okay.
Canada?
Okay.
Yeah. And where would you put Canada now?
But not like where they are, not where we think they should be.
No.
Like not an opinion, aspirational opinion about the right type of governance structure for Canada or Canada.
I mean, for
but-
Canada, it is very aspirational, right? Because you're doing the governance framework as you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so where were you before?
The same place, guided autonomy. And my guess was
Guided
that it would be provincial because
Oh.
I didn't think there was any federal regulation yet.
Right. Okay. All right. I think that is it. I think I've overstayed my welcome time-wise. So yeah, thank you so much. I hope this framework is useful at helping to analyze how governance works and what the priorities are behind the scenes.